So welcome back to Inside the Lords. I say welcome back because I haven't been doing very many of these Inside the Lords films, even though I've spent so many hours inside the Lords. And the reason for that is because Ella has been otherwise engaged, who does the films. And so a quick turn round to show that she's been productive in this period and that Morris is with us, joining us. There he is. But anyway, Ella has brought Morris and we are now sitting outside the Lords. The last few weeks, so much has happened that I can't possibly rehearse it. So it's just a few things I want to comment on today. This was quite a big week for me in terms of my parliamentary career, in inverted commas, because it was the first time that I moved a group of amendments, which meant that I got to talk about issues and I got the final word, which was really quite nice. But the amendments were on an issue which I am undoubtedly morally torn on, which is in relation to a part of the Public Order Bill, and particularly how we should treat people who gather outside abortion clinics. That it's not just women seeking termination who are affected by these vigils, but also often it's those health workers who are traduced and besmirched and, called horrible names. And to note, I consider those who provide reproductive health care in this atmosphere as nothing short of heroes and heroines. I want to state that. But what I really admired about what the Baroness Watkins said was, I think, the maturity of her comments, calling on us not to rush this clause through, although she thinks there's a problem. She's actually supportive of many aspects of this clause, that we do need to consider the inadvertent consequences for free speech, freedom of conscience, freedom to be obnoxious in certain places and say things that I don't agree with or what have you. Can we have some balance, she suggested. And so I think I've got a lot to think about when I reread Hansard. I, of course, will withdraw my amendments now, but I think that I will be back. That's not a threat, by the way. I will be back to ensure that the intentions of the movers of Clause 9 don't actually damage civil liberties in this country. That's my intention. I find the type of people who want to or think it's in any way a reasonable tactic to gather outside abortion clinics and, wave around gruesome images of fetuses and so on, not only distasteful, but I really think it's almost cruel and it's not a nice thing to do. Certainly if you were a woman going for a termination, you would feel absolutely outraged that they were intruding on your private decision to access legal healthcare. And if you work in a hospital or an abortion clinic and you get shouted at, it's unpleasant. But the context of this is that this is an amendment on a public order bill, which is a very serious attack on civil liberties. And when I read Clause 9, which was introduced by Stella Creasy into the House of Commons debate, it was absolutely clear that putting it in the Public Order Bill, almost hijacking the Public Order Bill to do it, actually, it was an entirely appropriate place for it to live, because it's also quite a serious assault on civil liberties. And so I was in this dilemma. What do? I'd like to nod it through. I'd like to pretend that it's okay. I can't stand the Just Stop Oil protesters who are the subject or the focus of the government's clampdown on protest, but I don't think that my irritation with them means that I can just simply say this law is necessary when I don't think it is. And I feel exactly the same actually about the anti-abortionists outside abortion clinics. So one thing I wanted to urge you to do is, all of these laws are publicly available. You can actually read Clause 9 and see what the wording is and what maybe the fuss is about. But it put me in a difficult situation, because the people I would normally be allied with, who are pro-choice, are up in arms with me for apparently not going along with what is considered a pro-choice amendment. The reason I mentioned this was, if I wasn't in the House of Lords, I would never have read the bill. I'm in the middle of a gale, by the way, something out nowhere. I would never have read the bill. I would have read the headlines in newspapers. But one difference is, now that I'm in the House of Lords, is I have to read the legislation I'm going to comment on. And when you read the detail, I suppose I feel I have an obligation to make public what would otherwise just be seen as kind of which side are you on, and to actually explain how laws are made, and to then not just allow laws to be made without at least raising some of the problems with them. So that's one thing. The other thing is that it was very irritating that in the debate in the House of Lords that there was a tendency to want to say, if you're opposed to this, you're basically betraying women who are accessing abortion rights. I think that is a cheap argument. It's not true. And I think that when then it was gone on to argue that this is paid for by big American money, and we had this sort of, horrible imagery of, we all know that outside abortion clinics in America there's been some terrible things have happened, physical threats made against clinicians and so on, people killed even, that somehow this was like we were all meant to get scared. And it just reminded me of the Black Lives Matters moment, where our outrage at the killing by the police of a black person, George Floyd, then led to the kind of introduction of scare tactics about the idea that every black person in this country was about to be killed by the police, and a kind of gaslighting that if you said anything to say, no, it's different in the UK, you're accused of basically being an appeaser to racism. And I think that we have to be very careful about deploying those tactics in debate and discussion, because it does really try and delegitimise a perfectly valid criticism or points being made by trying to do a guilt by association, that somehow you are only doing this because you're being influenced by dark, sinister forces. And I really object to that. And we've seen that being used against people in particularly the gender critical debate, but in all aspects of the free speech wars, where rather than having the argument about whether we need censorship, what the limits are, whether, as was argued at something I was at during the week vociferously by some young people, that all free speech is hate speech. Anyone who advocates for free speech is advocating for hate speech. And the argument is that there is some kind of association with bigotry because you believe in freedom. And I believe in freedom, and I'm not a bigot. And we have to not be intimidated by this attempt at delegitimising very important arguments in a free society. The other thing to say about the House of Lords at the moment is there's a very peculiar atmosphere, because it's pretty obvious to everybody in the country that the Conservative Party have 2 years but maybe no longer, and that Labour are therefore likely to be elected in the next general election. This is not a prediction, and I've no idea what will happen. I'm not being either pessimistic, optimistic or anything else. It's just that collapse of the Conservative Party is something we're all watching, and the betrayal of the 80-seat majority has been well documented. I don't need to go into it. As a consequence, the Conservatives are, to say the least, lacklustre and defensive and seem in array, and quite a lot of Conservative members are coming up saying, do you think it's all over? Is this the end of Conservatism as a party? What do you think that's going on? You'd also think, though, that the Labour Party would be quite buoyant, and in some ways they are taking themselves more seriously. They're almost like acting as a government in waiting, and we've already seen Keir Starmer make a range of comments that would indicate that he's keen to win the red wall seats back, whether it was on Brexit will not be overturned, or his comments on not using immigrants as cheap labour and not being dependent on immigration and so on. These are undoubtedly key matters that will, make it clear that he's having a turn. But the thing that's unconvincing is the Labour Party are all being very serious, and they look like they're a government in waiting, and they also look absolutely terrified, because I think they realise that it's not a given they're going to get these votes. They might scrape in, they might win, but then they've got to run the country, and they are actually a party that itself is not happy with itself and doesn't. Keir Starmer says some comments on immigration, and his own party members call him a racist, and say, why are you doing he says we're not going to overturn Brexit, and he's assaulted by all the Remainers who are in his party, who are activists. And so I think that we can safely say that the political realignment discussion is we're witnessing it, we're watching it happen, and we don't know how it's going to all play out. There's no doubt that there's more people saying that they're politically homeless than ever before, and I think it's incumbent on us to not say the status quo is good enough, but not just immediately knee-jerk call for the smaller parties to get votes. But we don't want people to feel disenfranchised. So I'm finding it difficult, to articulate exactly how we should approach party politics at the moment, which is why I'm always, at least with the Academy of Ideas, we're trying to reconstitute new traditions to build new movements, even if not new parties, and I'm still committed to that. So in the next few weeks in the Lords, I'm going to be pursuing the next round of the Higher Education Free Speech Bill, which I think, as the Academy of Ideas has been trying to build a new culture of academic freedom on campus rather than relying on the law. I'm simply trying to ensure that if this law is passed, which there's a lot of opposition to, because of course everybody in the House of Lords, I mean not everybody, but so many of them run colleges and say we don't know what the problem is, or they're kind of very unprepared to admit there's a serious problem of free speech on campus, despite so much evidence to the contrary. I will be arguing to strengthen the free speech provisions in the bill. I particularly want to ensure that there's a proper accountability for third-party organisations that are going into universities and setting values and policy standards that affect and undermine academic freedom, but which is not reflected in the bill. And I'll also be fighting off the amendments from opposition lords on all sides of the House who are trying to water down this bill so it's ineffectual and effectively toothless, and are trying to, I suppose, make it just a talking exercise that won't have any impact at all. So that's one thing I'll be doing. The second thing is I've signed up for a debate on immigration. This is what I want to finish on. Immigration and asylum, which has been called by the Archbishop of Canterbury. It's not it's got nothing to do with law or legislation. It's just an annual big event that he does. Actually, last year he called it On Free Speech, and I spoke then. I wanted to say something about immigration because today it's been announced that net migration is over 500,000. It's the highest it's been since the Second World War. Shocking figures, not because I'm frightened of lots of migrants, but because there is something ironic and deeply unsettling about so short after people did vote to stop free movement, having such figures officially acknowledged, and that's before you count the asylum seekers arriving in boats. I want to mention it because there's two different things that concern me. One is that there's no doubt that some of the free marketeer, even Brexit supporting Tories, do see migration in a completely instrumental way. I think that you can boost productivity through relaxing visas in certain ways, but they don't say it in any other way than, oh yes, that will help our growth happen because these people come over and work hard and earn less and so on. And that seems to me to be the wrong approach to the economic growth that we need to have in this country, which should be based on productivity, investment, and that would be investing in people who are here, investing in new technology, massive infrastructural growth projects, none of which are happening. So they're trying to cheat doing that. I also find it completely dispiriting that the small boats issue, which, I didn't want it to be an issue, but it is an issue because now all that the government says, well, we can't stop it. I mean, we're trying, it's failed. And you can see that it has really upset people who genuinely just say, what's happening to my area, like the recent reports on Blackpool, is that there's a huge uptick in I just said the word up to. There's a huge increase in homelessness. Lots of them happen to be ex-veterans, as it happens. At the same time as the hotels and the B&Bs are all full with migrants who've kind of been shipped in. And my concern is that the inability, the refusal of the government to get a handle on this, I'm not saying I know how, but to get a handle on this, the opposition, despite what Starmer said, effectively suggesting that anyone who is worried about it is a racist who hates migrants, is actually stirring an anti-immigration mood. And I don't mean an anti-migrant mood. There will be a backlash, right? This is not something any of us should welcome, right? We live in a tolerant, multi-ethnic society where people get on really well. There's been migration here for centuries. People are not worrying about migration because they don't like migrants, but because they feel that their concerns are being treated with contempt, and that the government are just saying, what can we do? And that was the atmosphere around Brexit that led people to say, well, we want some control over the society we live in. So to be told there's no control, I think rightly seems like an insult. But that lack of control could, I'm afraid, lead to people becoming bitter and resentful about individual migrants in their area and so on. And I don't want that to happen, because I don't think that is an inevitability, but it is because the political class don't appear to be able to get a handle on anything and see it through. And one of the reasons for that is they're far too dependent on legalese, rules. People can gain asylum through effectively playing the system. I don't blame those individuals, why wouldn't you? But that's because the system's wrong, and nobody will take it on board because they say we have to stick with the 1953 asylum bill and so on, refugee bill and so on. So I am going to speak on this issue, even though I don't want to, because it's difficult, and I'm going to try and think this issue through and come up with some way that I can approach it where I kind of try and get underneath the skin of the issue. I'm happy for you to let me know your thoughts on this. I won't tolerate racist thoughts. I don't bother with that. I mean, the explicit ones who just say that anyone who's not born in this country should be kicked out. I mean, go away. Back with attitudes. But I want to be sensitive to the mood. So, that's what I'm going to be thinking about in terms of writing a speech. And the first thing I do when I get back next week is write a speech on deliver a speech on the autumn statement and the economy. God knows what I'm going to say in that, other than it was a terrible budget. So that's what I'm going to be concentrating on over the weekend. And I have the honour of following Baroness Lee, Ruth Lee, who I've known for years, and she's asked me to follow her. That's the first. And when you follow someone, you kind of say something nice. Ruth Lee and I don't agree on anything, but we've always respected each other's. I mean, we agree on Brexit, but we've not agreed on lots of things over the years. But she was always very, very generous to me, and it's nice to be in a position where I'm an old hand welcoming Ruth Lee, who I really respect, as a new Baroness, and following up her speech with my own thoughts on the economy. The only reason I'm sharing those thoughts on the economy is so that I can support Ruth Lee. So that might be a rather weak. But anyway, that's my back in the Lords, and I'm hoping that Morris and Ella will be able to ensure that my records are kept up to date into the future. So see you next week.